to do today in this concluding lecture is I want to begin with a discussion of the book by Biju Mathew called Taxi, which was one of the readings that was assigned to you for this week, and then move on to some concluding thoughts, particularly about diasporas, nation states, transnationalism, globalization, you know, these set of issues, because ultimately I think we need to be able to locate our discussion of the Indian diaspora within some wider concerns that you know, perhaps you can think about in the years to come, because obviously such issues as globalization and the nation state are issues that are here to stay for some time, certainly. Now, this book that we have by Biju Mathew, so Biju Mathew is you know, somebody who had worked with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance for many years, as becomes quite clear upon reading the book, which is, and this is an activist organization in New York. One of the things that I found out, you know, in taking taxis in Los Angeles, one doesn't take taxis, by the way, quite often here, certainly not the way you take taxis in New York, because this is not really a taxi culture. And in New York, you know, if you're out in Manhattan or Brooklyn, Queens, wherever you are, you can flag down a taxi within a minute, usually. In Los Angeles, you have to usually call for a taxi. This is really, as I said, not a taxi culture at all. But you know, next time you take a taxi to the airport, talk to the taxi driver, because even in LA, drivers have what is called a taxi day, which is to say that you cannot pick up passengers from LAX just at random. There are certain days that are assigned to you, usually one day a week, which is assigned to you, and that's the only day on which you can actually pick up a passenger from LAX. So even if you drop a passenger, so let's supposing I take a taxi tomorrow morning to LAX, and the driver drops me over there, he's not supposed to pick up passengers from LAX unless it happens to be his taxi day. Okay? The taxi business is quite strictly governed. Most of the taxi drivers, especially in New York, this is less so the case in LA, where a substantial number of the taxi drivers, in fact, own the cab that they drive. In New York, the vast majority of the taxi drivers do not own the cab that they drive. And in order to ensure that you understand the gravity of the matter that Biju Mathew is talking about, let me just sort of encapsulate the pragmatics of this question very briefly, which is to say that there are a substantial number of taxi drivers who at the end of the day in New York, in fact, go home with nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the reason for that becomes quite clear when you read the book, because typically the way you run a taxi in New York is that you have to buy a medallion. So medallion is something that enables you to put a taxi on the road. Now, when Biju Mathew wrote this book, the cost of a medallion was $300,000. $300,000 when he wrote this book. That was some years ago. And if you've read the pages that were assigned to you, you would have noticed that even within 20 years, the cost of a medallion had shot up from something like $25,000 to $300,000. So the likelihood is that a medallion today costs somewhere close to $500,000. Now, if it costs $500,000, what this in turn means is that it is going to be impossible for most taxi drivers, the vast majority of whom, over 90%, are immigrants. And among these immigrants, you've got a large number of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, okay, people from West Asia. When I say West Asia, I mean what is called the Middle East over here. Okay, so countries like Egypt, Senegal, in Africa, Haiti, and so on. Right? The vast majority of the taxi drivers come from these countries and some others, but as I said, well over 90% are in fact immigrants. And if they're immigrants, what you can also understand is that these are, again, largely single male immigrants, may or may not be married, they may or may not have a family back home. And when they come here and they start driving a taxi, it's going to be impossible for them, obviously, to be able to afford $500,000. So what do they have to do? They have to lease the cab. Now, the rental for a cab, when Biju wrote this book, was something in the neighborhood of about $125 to $150 a day. So let's just assume that that stayed constant. I don't think it has. I think it's gone up. You know, I haven't spoken to him recently. I know the author quite well, but I haven't spoken to him recently to find out what the cost of a rental is today. But let's just assume that it's $150. Right? If it's $150, and then on top of that you have to add the cost of gas, all right, and you have to add other incidentals. So let's say a passenger boards your taxi, right, and has been drinking too much and vomits. You're responsible as a driver for having that car cleaned. So we can add another $75 for that. All right? So what he's basically established in the book, if you've read it carefully, and it's a book where you can actually skim through portions as well, certainly, right, is that at the end of the day, the likelihood is that most of these taxi drivers will not, in fact, actually be taking home any money at all. And if they do, it's a pittance. So what this book seeks to explain is a number of things. The first, it seeks to explain the origins of this system. How did this medallion system come about? Now, we don't really want to get into the details of that because, you know, this is not a course which is a history of the working class in America or, you know, the history of New York, so forth and so on. But what is very clear from what he says is that there is a commission, that's the Taxi and Limousine Commission, right? And essentially, the matter of how taxis are run in New York is regulated entirely by them, the TLC, the Taxi Limousine Commission. And the book begins with a description of a strike. The mayor at that time was Giuliani, right? Who, of course, is going to become well known, particularly after 9/11, because that's a time when apparently, at least according to people like Biju Mathew and many others, you know, he was extremely conservative man. But at that time, he seems to have redeemed himself because, of course, after 9/11, it called for heroics on the part of the administration of New York to get the city running again, given the gravity of what had happened in New York, right? But in any case, as you know, when the strike commences, the administration is utterly opposed to it. They were convinced that not more than 200 taxi drivers would actually take part in the strike. The 24,000 taxis that he's talking about on the streets of New York, and 98% of the taxi workers went on the strike. And then he delineates very briefly, Matthew, in this book, what were some of the benefits that were obtained by the workers, and why is it, you know, in consequence of the strike, and why is it that they went on a strike to begin with, right? And this has to do with various kinds of new regulations that have been framed by the Taxi and Limousine Commission. And again, that part of the story is less relevant for us than the considerations that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is, so what is the life of these South Asians like? South Asian working class. I mean, the South Asians that we have looked at in the United States, well, they were, not all of them came from the professional elite. You know, we spent quite a bit of time looking at the motel industry and how is it that the motel industry grew. And of course, you cannot describe these people who run the motels and who work there as elites by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, some of them might be only because some of them have become wealthy and now own a whole fleet of motels, but the bulk of them will be essentially operations run by, you know, a family who only have one motel. And the working conditions even in motels are reasonably difficult, right? Because we're talking about people who are working 14, 16 hours a day quite often. Yes?
Did the driver get a percentage of the meter? I mean, something had to go back to the owner from the fares.
Oh, yeah, something goes back. Yeah. But so, you see, I'm not giving you a full account, right? But that depends on the system that you have. If you have a lease, then that's what goes to the owner, because you're leasing the cab from the owner.
That's all he gets is $150.
That's what you would get. That's what you would get. Sometimes there may be a certain percentage of the total receipts for the day that may be added on. It depends on the agreement that the driver has with the person who's leased the cab to him, right? But what we are talking about is the rock bottom that has to be paid out no matter what happens. okay, at the end of the day. And so your question, if we started looking at it seriously and saying, well, what are the other overheads? Is there a certain percentage of the receipts, so forth and so on, that has to be paid? Well, then in that case, the amount that the driver actually owes to the company is even larger. I'm just taking the rock bottom, which is at $150 for the lease, the cost of the gas, and other overheads, such as, for example, insurance. Such as insurance. Right? And because even if the insurance is given by the company owner, there may be limitations on that insurance. It may not cover various kinds of things. Right? So what he's pointing out is that you're talking about running costs which may go up to $250, $300. One other thing that you need to note about taxis in New York, as opposed to taxis in Los Angeles, and the comparison really is not a just one, because as I said, this is not a taxi culture at all, frankly, LA. Right? You have to call for a cab. Very few people ever take a cab. But one big difference is that in New York, most of the fares that you are going to get are going to be relatively small fares. Relatively small fares. So you're going from downtown to 15 blocks instead of taking the metro, instead of taking the subway. All right? So most of the fares tend to be small. Sometimes the drivers prefer that, because sometimes if they get a huge number of small fares, because initially when you sit in the cab, there's a minimum that you have to pay. Right? But the problem with many of the small fares in the city also is that you're actually sitting in traffic for a very long period of time. And of course the meter is ticking away, but it's not ticking away in the same way as it is if you're speeding down a freeway, all right? Which is true in Los Angeles too, that there is waiting time. And every time you stop at a red light for 20 seconds, well, the meter is ticking away, but it's not comparable to being able to move down a road swiftly on a long drive, which is where you would make a huge amount of money, comparatively speaking, All right? So anyhow, let me return back to the scenario. So we are saying, okay, so what is the culture of these drivers? And that's one of the things that he describes, the culture of these drivers. How do they congregate? Where do they congregate? I've seen this in Chicago, by the way. I used to have a friend who used to drive a cab in Chicago. And in Chicago, as in New York, you have places which are open 24 hours a day. So at 3 a.m. at night, some of the drivers, who are doing the night shift will go to a place and they'll have their kebabs and masala chai and all of that. Again, LA doesn't really have joints like these as they do in Chicago and New York. And what he's describing there is a kind of a brotherhood that develops, amongst these drivers, because these people belong to what you might call a permanent bachelor community. That is, that even if they're married, it tends to be an intensely masculine kind of culture. Now, there are some insights that he talks about which I think are interesting. And one of them is that he narrates on page 31, if you want to look it up, that one of the incidents that he narrates is that after India went nuclear, that in the late 1990s, 1997, India exploded a nuclear device and became officially a nuclear state. And this was followed by Pakistan a few weeks later. Right? And so the animosity that exists in South Asia between India and Pakistan, not necessarily between the people of India and Pakistan, that's a different story. Many Indians who have gone to Pakistan and many Pakistanis who have gone to India, a large number of them have testified that the kind of hospitality that they get when they go to the other country is just extraordinary. Right? But certainly at the level of the nation state, there is obvious animosity and hostility between the two countries. And one of the things that we discussed in this class was how some of these conflicts get transferred from the situation back in South Asia to the diasporic setting, right? But what he's describing is a scenario which is quite different. And the scenario that he's describing here in this incident that he talks about on page 31 is where, in fact, notwithstanding the fact that India and Pakistan had both gone nuclear, right, that the Pakistanis and Indian taxi drivers continued to have their kind of friendship and brotherhood as it always had. And he's talking about the drivers in New York City. And on this subject, I want to add one more thing, that very often people have the impression, which in my view is a mistaken impression, namely that among the younger generation of South Asians, so let's say students who are South Asian over here, okay, and perhaps slightly older, maybe, that among the younger generation of South Asians, there is less of a bitterness about what happened between India and Pakistan, right, in the late 1940s, 50s, 60s. That is the partition of India which led to the creation of Pakistan. Now, I have found in my experience here, and I used to be very active with an organization that no longer exists. It's called a Coalition for an Egalitarian and Pluralistic South Asia. Right, so this organization was quite active in the Los Angeles area in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Most of the people who belonged to this organization, then subsequently dispersed. One of the founding figures of this organization passed away, and several others dispersed, including myself. But what we found was that when we had community events, and we had one of the partition, we found that people who had lived through the partition, or who, even if they had not lived through the partition, because to have lived through the partition means that you would now have to be, and if you had any memories of it, you would really have to be in your 70s, right, at least. You'd have to be in your 70s. The partition was in 1947. So we're talking about 66 years, almost 66 years. So people would have to be in their mid-70s if they were going to have any recollection of that. But even those who did not live through the partition but remember their parents telling them stories, such as myself. My father, for example, migrated, during this period of time. Right? That amongst these people, one found that there was a great deal of warm recollections about the other community. That even though a new nation state called Pakistan had been created in 1947, people remembered across the border, across the divide, the time that they had spent with the other community. In the younger generation, in fact, there was much more animosity, because the younger generation, and this is something I'm going to talk about in the latter half of my remarks today, and so I'm moving towards that as well. In the younger generation, the idea of the nation state is so firmly lodged in their minds that they cannot think beyond the nation state. Right? So for example, in the forums that we had under the coalition, and we had one big forum on 1947 on partition and its aftermath and its effect and its consequences and how it's remembered, right? What are the memories of it? Whatever the memories might be. We found at this forum that people who were in their 60s and 70s, even those who had suffered under the partition, and there were people who suffered to a great extent because they lost all their possessions. Some people, of course, lost members of their family. I mean, there were roughly 1 million people who were killed in that bloodbath, right? And we're talking about the largest number of people who moved across borders in history in a short period of time. We're talking about roughly 11 to 15 million people who became refugees almost overnight. And a large number of these people, not all of them, but a large number of these people lost all the land, all the possessions that they had. So if you're a Muslim living in India and you decided that you were going to migrate to Pakistan, or if you were Hindu who got left behind on that side of the border when the border was drawn, and you decided that you would migrate to India. And this is both in the western side of the country and then in the eastern side, where East Pakistan was created in 1947. So we found that even those who had actually lost their land, lost their possessions, had suffered grievous harm because they had lost a family member, or their women had been abducted. There were 75,000 abductions of women, for example. That many of these people, notwithstanding the trauma of what they went through, still could look back and say that, well, yeah, there were these differences that developed between us and the other community, but we also have very warm recollections of the time we spent with this community. And I'm suggesting to you that that among the younger generation, we found that not to be the case at all. We found a kind of a nationalism which was really quite extraordinary, right? So this is the subtext of what he's talking about here, you see? And what he's suggesting here in this little incident is that there can be a kind of a working class solidarity. We shouldn't assume that people simply decide that they're going to give their loyalties based on the concept of the nation state. All right, now, in this book, he goes on to describe a number of other things, and what I really want to do is I just want to look very briefly at a number of incidents, but before I do that, and I don't want to really go over the whole history, because if you read these pages, even if you skim through them, you would have noticed that what he does is he takes you back to the 1930s to the Haas Act, which is when numbered medallions began to be issued. By the way, when they were issued in 1937, the medallion cost $5, right? And today we're saying $500,000. Just look at the extraordinary increase in price. And there were these fleet medallions and there were these individual medallions. So also individual medallions were people who would have only one taxi cab. So, somebody who had money enough to buy a medallion at that point in time. And these were proportioned roughly 60% of them were fleet medallions. So this would be somebody who was wealthy enough to be able to have a whole fleet of taxis. And that's why it's called a fleet medallion. Eventually this distinction is going to collapse. And he points out that by the mid-1970s that the cost of the medallion had gone up to somewhere between $12,000 to $14,000 for a fleet medallion and a $28,000 for a private medallion. And then this distinction is going to disappear for reasons that he talks about over here. Right? Now, today in New York, about New York City, not New York State, New York City, which is the 5 boroughs, right? Roughly 12 to 15% of the people who actually drive taxis own their taxis. That number has gone down, by the way, even in the years that he's written this book. So we're talking about maybe roughly 10 to 12%. And one of the things that he points out is a change in New York City itself, that this is a city that is no longer really hospitable to this working class culture. So he calls it, by the way, he uses this really interesting acronym, FIRE, a city of fire. What does the acronym FIRE stand for? Finance, insurance, and real estate. In other words, the city has gone over to this class of people who basically are making their money from real estate, finance, insurance. In other words, according to Biju Mathew, people who really do nothing, right? But it's the kind of people who have taken over the United States in a fundamental sense, right? You look at the influence that Wall Street has. Right, so this is a kind of scenario that he sets up. Now, let's look at a couple of these incidents. So on page 129-30, he has a description. He has a description of what he calls Operation Refusal. Okay, so what was this Operation Refusal? This Operation Refusal was that the Taxi Limousine Commission received complaints, and there was a famous incident involving a well-known Hollywood actor, Danny Glover, right? And what were these complaints that were received? That once in a while they would get a complaint saying that, well, hey, the taxis are not stopping to pick up certain kinds of passengers. So if you're a black man and you're trying to flag down a taxi, you're having a really hard time, right? And sometimes it may be a white man for different reasons, depending on the political outlook of the taxi driver. Okay, and these things happen all the time. I don't know how many of you recall this famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, I would say notorious, but notorious incident involving a very famous black Harvard professor, okay, Henry Louis Gates. It made it to the New York Times. Right? And what was the incident that we're talking about here? When Henry Louis Gates is a professor at Harvard University, well established in the profession for years, okay, one of the major African American scholars in this country. And so 2-3 years ago, he went back home. Well, he had forgotten his keys or something. So he jumps over the door, the gate that he has, and I don't remember the exact details. The alarm is set off. The neighbors or someone close by, calls the police, and the police arrive there within a couple of minutes and are on the verge of arresting him. Okay, and they say, who are you? And he says, well, I'm Professor Gates, and I happen to be the owner of this home. And they laugh. They say, you can't possibly be a professor. You're a black man. You can't be a professor at Harvard. That's unthinkable. Right? And what the hell are you doing? Jump over your own gate. There's no credibility to your story at all. Right? So in fact, actually, this becomes a matter of national attention. And eventually, if some of you might recall this, that eventually Obama invited him to the White House and they had a beer together. Right? All right? Okay, but that's Skip Gates, so he eventually can go and have a beer at Harvard, but if you're a taxi driver, there's no likelihood that's going to happen. And what the Operation Refusal is about is precisely this, that what they did was they posted, okay, so they would have, two people, let's say a black man and a white man, or a black woman and a white woman, and they would sort of have them at intervals of, let's say, 50 meters. So one person tries to flag down a taxi, doesn't succeed, then the other person flags down a taxi and succeeds. And so therefore they come to the conclusion that, what we have here is a case of racial discrimination. Okay, so he discusses this because he points out that, in fact, one of the people that they picked up, the reason why he didn't pick up the passenger, and this was, by the way, before he could even proceed to the second passenger. That, when he turned down the passenger, okay, immediately these people, who are there on the street, they sort of pounce upon him and say, well, you're not supposed to do this, okay, you violated the laws, because if somebody flags down a taxi, you're supposed to take them. And so he tried to explain that, well, look, he had run out of the paper that is needed for the meter, because by law, when somebody gets into a taxi and then gets off the taxi, you're supposed to issue them a receipt. Okay? And he'd run out of the paper that is used, that is connected to the printer with the meter. And so that was what he had mentioned. And in fact, this incident is described in some detail, because what he's trying to suggest is that this was one of the ways in which drivers are routinely oppressed. So what he's describing here is a culture of oppression under which these drivers live. Now, the critical element of the story, which will move us to the last segment, is really the following: that what Mathew is interested in talking about here is a number of things. One is, okay, what can we say about such things as multiculturalism in the United States? Right? This is a profession that belongs really to the immigrants, so to speak. That the vast majority of taxi drivers are immigrants. And there is this kind of liberal view. The liberal view is that the world is getting smaller and smaller, it's shrinking. Right? That Thomas Friedman is one of the advocates of this view. Hillary Clinton, in her own way, is an advocate of this view. Right? Many are. That the world is shrinking, it's getting smaller because the internet, social media, right? All of these things, the pace at which technology moves, the frequency with which we take flights, for example, right? All of these things have made the world smaller. It's shrunk the world in many ways. Right? And Mathew's view, of course, is quite different. My view is quite different on this as well. Right? And how should we think about it? Well, let me give you an illustration. So, for example, yes, it's certainly true that if you look at the number of miles that a person is going to log today, it's going to be much greater than what it would have been 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, not to mention 100 years ago. Right? But I think that the nature of interactions has substantially changed. And that is going to determine whether the world, in fact, is smaller or not, whether it's shrunk or not. So in this, the illustration that I want to give you is the following one. And this takes us back to something I had mentioned in the beginning of this course. So that's why I'm taking this illustration, because I want to take you back to what we had started with. What we had started with was a scenario where I described to you a world called the Indian Ocean world. And in this Indian Ocean world, you had a massive trading system. So you recall that you could not go to any port, for example, on the east coast of Africa, on the South China Sea. Right? So what was this Indian Ocean world? It encompassed both the coasts of India and encompassed what today would be called the Gulf states, right? Including Aden, the east coast of Africa, all of Southeast Asia, what is today Malaysia, for example, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Malay archipelago, and then portions of China. Right? So we're talking about a huge world. And there was a very extensive trading system in this world. A very extensive trading system. And you could not go to a single port for centuries. You know, from, let's say, the 2nd, 3rd century of the Christian era, so let's say roughly around 200 AD when we begin to see documentation of some of this, down to the 16th, 17th century, before the onset of colonialism and the collapse of what used to be the Indian Ocean world system, trading system. That for around 1400, 1500 years, you could not go to a single port and not run into a Gujarati. Every place you went into, you would run into a Gujarati. You know. Right? Now, there's a book that was written about 20 years ago by Amitav Ghosh. I think I mentioned this book in passing. This is a time to reinforce the importance of a study such as that one, called In an Antique Land. And one of the things that Amitav Ghosh does in this book is he sort of gives you an idea what this world was like. And he's intrigued by this because he comes upon a letter in an archive in Egypt. Okay? And this letter goes back to several hundred years. And it's a letter written by an Indian merchant living in Aden. And it's written to an Indian merchant living on the west coast of India. So we're talking about a distance of a couple of thousand miles. And at the end of that letter, he says, I send greetings to your slave as well. So he's really intrigued by the letter. Why would you send greetings to your friend's slave, for example? Okay, it would be a little bit like, you know, somebody who's living in Manhattan in one of these penthouses, you know, worth millions, and writing a letter to another friend. Well, now it would be an email almost, certainly, right? And saying, yeah, hey, buddy, how are you doing, so forth and so on. And then you end that email and saying, well, you know, I send greetings to your housekeeper and your maid and your driver and your cook. Right? But nobody would do that. So he's intrigued. What is it? Why is he sending greetings to this person's slave? Did slavery mean the same thing that it means in the African-American context here? Okay? And how were these people communicating with each other to begin with? And what this impels him to do is to investigate the whole Indian Ocean world. And one of the things that he finds out is that, of course, if you're moving around in the 16th, 17th century or the 10th century, or much earlier than that, your movements are going to be dictated by the pattern of the winds. Because when you're moving on the seas, the monsoons, the whole Indian Ocean world, the monsoon is critical. Now, if you get stuck in the monsoon, right, provided you survive that, right, if you get stuck by a monsoon, your mobility may be restricted for 2 or 3 months, at least. So people had to plan this rather carefully, that when you did trading, you took your goods, so you have a ship full of goods, whatever they are, that you're taking from India and you're taking them to Aden, or back and forth, that when you go down there, you may have to put down roots for 3 or 4 months. Because once you've arrived there, and then it's the onset of the monsoons, okay, you cannot be out in the seas while the monsoon is going on. You know, because you're not likely to survive it. Your boat might capsize, so forth and so on. Now, when they put down roots, so how did Indian communities develop in places like Ethiopia? You know, there is evidence of Indian settlements in Ethiopia going back centuries. They developed precisely because people established these deep-rooted connections with each other, married into other communities. And today's traveling is very different. You hop on a plane, you know, you transact your business deal. You arrive in London, and the next day you're out of there, and you have logged on frequent flyer miles. Right? That does not mean the development of a community. So we shouldn't be seduced by the idea that merely because there's greater speed today, that therefore we are more interconnected. In fact, you could argue exactly the opposite, that it becomes more and more difficult to establish a substantive notion of a community in our times. All right? So this is, in a sense, what he's leading to, because the discussion towards the end of the pages that were assigned to you about such things as multiculturalism. What do we mean when we say multiculturalism? Because frankly, he argues, and some of you might be shocked at the argument, because you might be thinking of multiculturalism in very lofty ways, that, hey, this is really progressive, so forth and so on. But he argues that multiculturalism is the new form of racism, in fact. It's the new form of racism, because what it is simply is that you're sitting over here and, you feel you're very multicultural because, yes, today you had a Greek meal, then tomorrow you're going to have a Chinese meal, and then day after tomorrow you're going to have a Japanese meal, and you might say, oh, I've got a few friends from, who happen to be brown and colored and so forth and so on. That doesn't make you multicultural. I'm going to tell you another anecdote about that, which is, again, I mean, when I read about it, I was astonished. I read about it in Harper's Magazine. There's actually a company, believe it or not, that was around for a period of time called Rent a Nigger. Rent a Nigger. Okay? So what it was that you're sitting in your penthouse suite in Manhattan or wherever, and you feel, hey, look, man, I'm going to have a party. I'm going to invite the cream of, society here. But, I want to make sure that people understand that I'm liberal. I'm multicultural. I've got friends in the black community. Well, of course, you don't have a single friend in the black community. So what do? You call up this company. And they'll send over a black chap to you, and of course he's going to be trained. So he's sent over a day before, and he's going to be tailored to be able to tell everybody that, yeah, he went to Harvard class of 82 or 78 or whatever it is. And of course they take people who have got slightly more polished accents, right? And then this guy comes in the evening properly suited and booted, and he mills around with the crowd. And you introduce your friend. Oh yeah, we were batchmates at Harvard together. And this is Joel, right? Can you believe it? That's multiculturalism for you. Right? We have to understand, that's what he's trying to understand. What is the politics of these liberal platitudes and certitudes that we have all sort of accepted? And of course somebody here will say, yeah, but that's an exception, things don't really happen that way. There are subtle forms and there are less subtle forms through which multiculturalism operates in the world today. It's really become a form of consumption for the most part, of course. And what we have to try to understand, what are the real forms of solidarity, right? So there's this anecdote that I suggested to you in my previous lecture that I mentioned to you, not suggested to you, that I mentioned to you, and I want to just look at that once again. So this is pages 162 to 3. You can read about it later on, and it concerns one taxi driver by the name of Rizwan. Rizwan is a Muslim, South Asian Muslim. You can tell from the name right away, of course. Okay, so this concerns this taxi driver, Rizwan, and this is what Mathew says. Rizwan had picked up a passenger near Grand Central Station heading for the East 80s. He had completely forgotten that he tuned in, as he normally did at the start of his shift, to a left liberal radio station, WBAI 99.5, which is the equivalent of Pacifica in New York. And then the passenger gets into this cab and says, what the fuck is that on the radio? Is that the radio really, or are you listening to some fucked up tape? Rizwan informed the passenger that it was indeed the radio. I'm quoting directly from him. In fact, WBAI was airing a program on New York City schools. As the host detailed the racist aspects of the education system, the passenger grew angrier by the minute. This cannot be the radio. It's disgusting. When he got no response from Rizwan, he exploded. Ask all of them to get out of here. Right? That's the common response. You don't like the country, or you're going to have these left liberal sentiments. Go somewhere else. Go to where you came from. Right? Who wants them here? Leave, man, leave. If you don't like it here. Now Rizwan had a choice. But somehow I felt that I should not shut the radio off at this moment. To do that would be really bad, so I let it play on, and he just lost it. That's the passenger, right? He started banging on the seat and calling it all fucked up and that we should all get out of here. Here is where I should maybe have kept quiet, but I couldn't. I asked him if he knew who the person on the radio was, and of course he didn't, and so I told him that the host was an African-American activist. But that didn't shut him up. He kept saying that he couldn't care who it was. I knew the guy was Irish by now. This is also interesting. Rizwan concludes that this passenger has to be an Irish, right? Why does he have to be Irish? You see, we all have our stereotypes, right? Okay, I had guessed it, so I asked him if he was Irish. Now that surprised him. And he stopped for a moment and then said yes. I could again have stopped here because my question had kind of tripped him a bit. But I didn't. I kept driving and in my calmest voice told him that we should work on it together. I told him that the African Americans got here probably 100 years more before his folks showed up here. Right? This is that priority of arrival. And that he should transport his Irish ass back to Ireland. And then we should move the Italian ass back to Italy, and the German and the British. Right? And then we could finally see if the African American should go back and leave this place to the Native Americans. At this point, he fell silent, and I pulled over and asked him to get out of my cab. And of course, you know that he's probably now going to get into a huge amount of trouble. That's the problem, right? Because if he's stopped the cab and he's thrown the passenger out of the cab. Right? So that's politics for you. That's politics on the ground for you. Right? So, because what he's trying to understand is, well, what are the conditions under which we achieve solidarity? Why do people make these arguments that, well, hey, I came here before you did, meaning my ancestors came here before I did. So therefore, somehow that gives me some kind of rights over you. Or this priority of arrival, you know, makes me a better American or more secure American, so forth and so on. So this is the scenario that he's really laying out for you, because he's saying, well, what are the conditions under which we think about multiculturalism, solidarity across class, right? To what extent do ethnicity, nation building, nationhood, to what extent do all of these things really matter? And so using this as a platform, let me move to my last set of remarks. And this is where that article that you have by Arjun Apodrai is really an important piece. Not that one has to necessarily agree with all of it, because frankly, I don't agree now with much of what he said, but this piece was written, let's say 15, 20 years ago, and perhaps he might now reflect on it a little bit differently too, because at that point it might have looked like we were in a space where the idea of the post-national state would become attractive, and had become attractive. Okay? And so when we say post-national state, what we're talking about is that what is the status of this thing that we call the nation state? Okay? And this is important when we're looking at such questions as the question of the diaspora, because most Americans are frankly hyphenated Americans. So when I say hyphenated Americans, so you're Italian American, right? Or you're Chinese American, Indian American, and so on. Incidentally, by the way, the only persons who are not hyphenated are white Americans. They're not hyphenated. Right? You don't hyphenate white American. You hyphenate Italian American. You literally hyphenate it. You hyphenate Chinese American, but you do not hyphenate white American. And there's an argument that's made by the French, theorist, structuralist writer Roland Barthes, a famous writer. And one of the things that he argues, he has his argument about what he calls ex-nomination. Okay? What does he mean by that? What he means by that, ex-nomination, is those who are outside. Ex is outside, right? The Latin prefix here. Nomination, those who do not need to be named. The implication always was that if you were an American, you were a white American. That was the implication for a very long period of time. It was understood that to be American meant to be white American. And if in countries such as Japan, until quite recently I experienced that I'm actually don't hold an American passport, but there are people I know who do, and I was with them, and Indians as well. And if they were asked who they were, and they said we're American, and the Japanese would say, well, you can't be American, you're Indian. You look Indian, you don't look like an American. Well, what does an American look like? Of course, right? That's the point. So Roland Barthes is saying that white Americans belong to what he calls the world of ex-nomination. They do not need to be named. They are the norm. And then everyone else is either absorbed into the norm or deviates from the norm. Right? So that's why everyone else has a hyphenated identity. Now this hyphenated identity produces complications, or possible complications. It may not be a complication for the person who has that identity. It may or may not be. It may be a problem for others who feel that if you're Italian American or Chinese American or Indian American, they may be a potential problem. What is that potential problem? The potential problem is that, so if you have this hyphenated identity, right? The left half of you is what we would call the diasporic person. That you could be an Italian American, and you could have been here for generations. For 3 generations, 4 or 5 generations. Most of the Italians, by the way, would have come about late 1800s, early 1900s. That's when the great Italian migrations would have taken place. Okay? Right? You don't really have Italians coming in 1800. You know, at this point it's still Anglo and Scandinavian. Right? So if you go to the Midwest, you see a large Scandinavian influence, right? Okay? So, you know, there are different times when different people come, or coming from different regions of the world. But so let's say 4 generations, 5 generations. Okay? So you're 4 or 5 generations of the Italian here. Even then, and even though you are an American, you're a full-fledged American citizen, born here, you don't know a word of Italian, except, you know, some word that everybody knows. Okay? And you know, you say something like Mamma Mia, and you think, well, you know Italian. All right? So what is happening here? What is happening here is that even in the 4th or 5th generation, you still have some of that Italian, as it were, sensibility or blood, you think, in you. This idea of blood, by the way, is another very seductive, slippery idea. I'm frankly clueless about what it means. You know, when I say clueless, I mean I know the literature on it, but when people say, well, that's my bloodline, well, you know, people's bloodline is not what they imagine it to be. For example, a huge number of people here have some American Indian or African American in their bloodline too. They might not recognize it, and they might not want to recognize it, but they do. And this has been amply documented by people who understand exactly the circumstances under which it occurred, of course. All right? So what we're speaking about here now is this, that let's take the Italian American. That, you know, this left half of this identity is your diasporic identity, that you feel something in common with Italians, whether they're here or whether they're back in Italy. I think I mentioned this to you in passing. You know, The Godfather is an interesting illustration, right? I don't know how many of you have seen all parts of it, but if you've seen all parts, if you haven't, I suggest that you do, because it is a real epic, okay, right? What's interesting is how that link stays, right? Long after Don Corleone's, you know, he's passed away, Michael has become the godfather, he's got children, right? And yet the link stays there throughout. That's the diaspora. Let me put it to you in a different way. That there is a tussle between the centrifugal and centripetal forces. Right? What is it? The centrifugal forces tend to always disperse. Right? Dissipate. Centripetal is coming together. This is what the state attempts to do. So if you now look at the right-hand side of the equation here, you say an American. Well, that means that you give your loyalty to the state, nation-state called America. At least your material loyalty, and the loyalty that is usually tested by such things as the national anthem, national flag, so forth and so on. Right? It's quite interesting. I mean, I've only been to one professional game in my life in the United States, you know, but you stand up before the game and then, you know, you sing the national anthem or whatever, at least they did back then in 1982 when I went to that game, right? And, you know, you're supposed to feel a surge of pride and so forth and so on. Right? That's what the national anthem is supposed to do. And of course, India is a sheer anomaly, which is what makes the Indian diaspora really interesting and what makes India interesting. Why is it a sheer anomaly? Because in effect, India, it's the only country in the world, by the way, of which this is true. Right? India is, in effect, a country that has 3 national anthems, none of which is in the national language. Okay, so for those of you South Asian, you would be interested in, so there's Jana Gana Mana, right, which is a song composed by Rabindranath Tagore. It's not in Hindi. Okay, it's not in Hindi. It's in Sanskrit, a language that nobody speaks, mind you. Okay? Then you have Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, better than all other countries is our, right, nation called Hindustan. And who's the composer of that, by the way? The composer of that became subsequently the national poet of Pakistan, India's sworn enemy, Sir Muhammad Iqbal. And Sare Jahan Se Acha is in Urdu. And then we have a third one called Vande Mataram, which is half in Bengali, half in Sanskrit. Vande Mataram is Hail the Motherland, composed in the late 1800s by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. I'll see if I can get to your question, man, because I need to finish my train of thought, yeah? So what we have is effectively three national anthems. This drives the Hindu nationalists crazy. I mean, they just get livid, you know, because they say, why can't we be a proper nation state? A proper nation state has one national anthem in the national language. And India has to be muddled up as usual, and it's muddled up even with respect to its national anthem. Of course, that's the glory of it. Because there is a kind of pluralism on the ground, which you cannot simply produce through an official doctrine called multiculturalism. And that's what the universities try to do. That's what UCLA tries to do. They try to produce multiculturalism from the top. So let's have a diversity requirement, you know, a diversity requirement, right? Everybody should know something about India or China or Pacific, you know, islands or, you know, whatever it is, right? So you have this diversity requirement. This is all multiculturalism produced from the top. See? We are talking about what it means to have a genuine kind of pluralism on the ground. So now, if you go back to this scenario over here, one of the things that Apodra is talking about is that there's this constant tension. There's a constant tension. Why is there constant tension? Because on the left-hand side, you have what would be called the nation/diasporic identity. Right? There's a difference between a nation and a nation state. There are people who constitute a nation, but do not constitute a nation state. Right? I mean, the best example of that, obviously, would be the Palestinians. That Palestinians all over feel that there's something which unites them. Right? There may be political differences amongst them, so forth and so on. And this is where we get to the question about what is it that makes a nation? There was a classic essay on this which I urge you to read. You can find it on the internet by Ernest Renan. What is a nation? A classic essay. Not that we have to agree with what he says, but he's trying to understand what makes a nation a nation. Is it the feeling that we all have that is in common? What is that feeling? Is it the fact that we share the common blood? Well, what does that mean? That we share one language? Well, very often we don't. In India, people do not share one language. Right? And so one of the ways in which nations attempt to produce that unity is precisely through such things as the textbook. Let's have a textbook which is common to everybody. Right? That's what schools do. They homogenize subjects into becoming subjects of the nation state. Then you have national anthems, you have national flags. Right? Those are the things that produce this sense of unity, homogeneity, and so on. But it comes at a great price, frankly. So in this identity, we're saying that, and this is the tension that he's exploring. We're saying that you're an Indian American. So let's now go back to the case of Indians. Right? So you're an Indian American, and the Indian part of you, as it were, I'm now really putting it in colloquial terms, that is the left-hand part of that identity, right? Feels some kind of affinity with the notion of India, with Indian civilization. Perhaps if you have collapsed India and Hindu into one category, which one shouldn't, but many people do, then perhaps some notion of affinity with what it means to be a Hindu, you know, share in something called Hinduism, because obviously there are a large number of Indians who are not Hindus, right? There may be Muslims or Christians, and so forth and so on. And on the other hand, that American part of it, which is the other part of your identity, is the part of identity which is attached to the idea of the state. And one of the ways in which you know a state is through a document called the passport, for example. Right? The states issue passports. They issue you passports. So that's why the Palestinians are not a nation state, among other things. There is no such thing as a Palestinian passport, really. Okay, or if you belong to the Basque community, which is the Basques are a separatist group, right? They can't issue a passport that's going to be well, they can, but it's not going to be recognized anywhere else in the world. Or the Khalistanis who had waged a secessionist battle, remember, in the Punjab, and then carried out this battle long distance from here as well. They actually, by the way, they had an official government in exile called the government of Khalistan. They even issued passports. Well, try traveling to any part of the world with a Khalistan passport. Wouldn't work. So this is a tension that he's exploring. Now, there are certain arguments about what is the future of the nation state. Are we living in a post-national world? And I think I shared some of my thoughts with you about that in the previous lecture, where I suggested to you that, well, I think it's really quite premature at this point to be thinking about a post-national world. As an ideal, it may be wonderful. Then we may have to understand what a transnational world, will there be a transnational government? Because certainly the United Nations is not even remotely close to being a transnational government. The United Nations, I hope you understand, is deeply implicated in the nation-state system, completely implicated in the nation-state system. So it's got two bodies, the General Assembly and the Security Council, and the nation-state is critical for both of them. Of course, the General Assembly is not critical at all. I mean, it's just what I'm going to call a hocus-pocus body. Because the Security Council does exactly what it wants to do, which means the 5 powers that have the veto do exactly what they want to do. The General Assembly is like a glorified Commonwealth. You pass resolutions condemning such and such country, it doesn't mean a thing, frankly. Right? So it's the United Nations is not an example of a transnational government. There are transnational organizations such as Amnesty, perhaps, Greenpeace, Doctors Without Borders, as I discussed it in my previous lecture. And even there we have fundamental problems because most of these organizations cannot operate in a country without the permission of that nation state. They cannot do so. And all over the world, borders have been much more tightly regulated in the last 15, 20 years. There was a person who had given a talk at UCLA about a year ago, and satellite pictures, and the world has never been more fenced in than it is today. Huge chunks of the world have fences where there used to be simply borders that you could just cross at will. Sheep's grazing on one side of the border and wanders into the other side, and there is no real border there. It's just something that we understand exists or that we imagine. Much of that has evaporated in the world. Of course, the fencing of the border between the United States and Mexico, the fencing in Palestine, right, on the West Bank, the fencing between India and Bangladesh. By the way, the part of the world, and this is the great tragedy of it from the point of view of someone like myself, that what was really perhaps one of the most pluralistic civilizations, and continues to be in many ways, this is where the fencing is now the greatest. If you look at the satellite pictures, together, the fence between India and Pakistan and the fence between India and Bangladesh, okay, this is greater than the fencing anywhere else in the world. Right? So this is a scenario that we're talking about, and I think that when we look at the Indian diaspora, I think that's the context in which we're going to have to evaluate what it means to speak of an Indian diaspora. All right, is there, Akbar, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, on the topic of language.
Yes.
Besides the difference in the alphabet, is there any difference
Or between Hindi and Urdu?
Yeah.
Well, yes, there can be, and I'll tell you when the difference becomes acute. It becomes acute particularly at times of tension. Because what happens? What happens is the Hindi becomes extremely Sanskritized. So I think I should explain to some of you who may not be aware of what it is that we are talking about over here. The question that Akbar is asking is that, so you remember I had mentioned to you that there's a song called Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, and I said this is not in Hindi, it's in Urdu. Okay, and the poet who wrote this Because, of course, when he wrote it, India was undivided. It was written long before the partition of India in 1947. And then he becomes the national poet of Pakistan, Sir Muhammad Iqbal. So the scenario that we are describing, I'll just conclude with that. So, see, people in India and Pakistan, I'm speaking only about those Indians who speak Hindi. Because if you're living in Bengal and you're speaking Bengali, or if you're living in Tamil Nadu in the south and you're speaking Tamil, this argument doesn't really apply for those people. But if you are a Hindi speaker, so in India, right, you've got Hindi, and in Pakistan, you've got Urdu. And essentially, the question that Akbar is asking is, because he's trying to understand whether it's relevant to say that Sare Jahan Se Acha is not in the national language, right? Is there a real difference? Because these two languages are mutually exchangeable, if I may put it this way. They are mutually, you can understand Hindi if you're an Urdu speaker, and you can understand Urdu if you're a Hindi speaker, right? They're mutually intelligible to speakers of the languages. However, that's not true all of the time. When is it not true? That's the interesting question. And in fact, this common spoken form is actually called Hindustani. And there's also a difference in the script. So that was the other part of the question. That if for example, I'm a Hindi speaker. But if I go to Pakistan, can I read the newspaper published in Urdu? Although I can understand the spoken form of Hindu, I cannot understand the written form of Hindu. Why? Because of Urdu. Why? Because it's written in a different script. Completely different script. So can't understand it at all. And similarly, an Urdu speaker, unless they've actually learned how to read Hindi, will not be able to read Hindi. They will not be able to read Hindi. That's already a big consideration. But there's another consideration. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that, let's supposing there's tension between India and Pakistan, and you listen to, where would you go to get the news? You go to the television stations. What happens? What happens is that in India, the Hindi is Sanskritized. That is, they introduce large number of words from Sanskrit, and it's going to become quite unintelligible to the Urdu speaker. And similarly, what happens in Pakistan? So there's a war between India and Pakistan going on. And you listen to, I turn on Pakistan television and I say, let me listen to what they're saying in Pakistan about my country, India. Right? I cannot follow half of the news. Why? Because the Urdu, that is the Hindustani there, they use a large number of words from Arabic and Persian at that point. So 90% of it is mutually intelligible. That 10% is not, and that 10% is going to become 50% on both ends of the divide. Okay? That's the answer. Yes?
Who was the author of the What is a Nation? The essay you said.
Renan. Ernest Renan. R-E-N-A-N. You just Google Renan, What is a Nation, you'll find it, the article available. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to email the exam to you by 1 o'clock today. All right? And the instructions are clear. Thank you.